I assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Free and uncorrupted communication.
You know, it's very difficult to introduce Kimberle Williams Crenshaw because all of us know who she is. She is clearly one of the most well-known public intellectuals in America. Many of us know her by her award-winning work that really changed our conception of the intersectionality of race, gender, and equality. I first met Kim in 1986 when I was a professor of sociology at UCLA, and I was invited to the hallowed halls of the law school as a lowly sociologist. And there was a discussion there on race and poverty. And I was just really an observer because the language in the conversation was a little over my head. And one person just seemed to cut through the rather highfalutin conversation with such clarity and brilliance that I just could not imagine that the young woman I saw was the person doing that, and that was Kimberle Williams Crenshaw. It was my introduction to a person whose intelligence is awe-inspiring, whose brilliance is amazing, and whose commitment to scholarship and progressive social change is legion. I don't want to go through all of her accomplishments. Obviously, she is a lawyer by training with a JD from Harvard and LLM from Wisconsin. She has worked not only in the U.S. arena, but she is an international resource for the progressive community. She's facilitated workshops for civil rights activists in Brazil and constitutional court judges in South Africa. She was influential in drafting the Equality Clause in the South African Constitution. And in 2001, she authored the background paper on race and gender discrimination for the UN World Conference Against Racism. Kim is just an awe-inspiring person for all of us committed to brilliant and clear scholarship and who also want to pursue social change. So without further ado, let me introduce Kimberle Williams Crenshaw, who will speak on gendered violence and racialized prisons, an intersection tale of two movements.
Dr. Oliver, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and more particularly, I want to say a belated welcome back to California. As he mentioned, we were colleagues at UCLA too long ago, in fact, for me to actually confess to you. But I'm delighted to be able to welcome him back to the UC family, and I hope to see more of you. I'm also very happy to be with you here today. I have to apologize to the conference organizers that I wasn't able to attend the conference. We're at the end of our term at UCLA, and not too surprisingly, it's the time that they're grabbing us for all of the work that they want to get out of us over the summer. But I'm delighted to have been asked to be part of this conference, and let me tell you a couple of the reasons why this is a good opportunity. Thank you. Thanks, Howie. Okay. And let me get. Thank you. So over the last year and a half, I have sort of switched hats. I've been in the academy for I'm not going to say, but long enough. And like a lot of progressive academics who are interested in thinking critically and productively about how to better mobilize politics towards ends that we think are more humane, I haven't had a lot of opportunities to actually put some of my ideas to the test. It's really easy to be in the academy and talk to each other and to reinforce each other, but the real challenge is whether our ideas have any currency in the actual trenches of progressive mobilizing. And it's also a challenge to figure out whether we can take back from those experiences into the academic community some of the challenges that our allies are facing in resisting some of the forces of subordination that seem to be growing in our country. So I got a call one day from a former colleague of Melvin Oliver's, Anthony Romero, who's the executive director of the ACLU, asking if I was interested in becoming a racial justice fellow at the ACLU. Now, for some of you who know some of my work, particularly on hate speech, you might find it surprising that I entertained the notion about going to the ACLU. But I thought it was a good opportunity for us to really test out our ideas and really get a sense from inside what the nature of the struggle is and get a sense about whether any of the things that we're talking about are remotely useful to those folks who are really advocates. So I've been working on 2 projects over the course of the year, and this is an opportunity for me to bring some of that thinking and some of the work back to you, basically to have an exchange, to talk about whether some of the work that we are doing is particularly enterprising, useful, and ultimately transformative. One of the projects, and the one that I was initially going to talk about when I was first contacted by the MCC, is an attempt to push back Ward Connerly's efforts in Michigan to basically take 209 across the country. And a lot of us see this as make or break for Ward Connerly. If he's able to be stopped in Michigan, then we think he can be stopped anywhere, and we think that perhaps his money will dry up. So some of what we're doing there is trying to reframe the way affirmative action is talked about, try to reframe the image of who affirmative action beneficiaries actually are, try to develop the best arguments for affirmative action that don't rely on solely ideas about diversity, but actually do mobilize ideas about social justice, access, and fairness. And that was what I was going to talk to you about today and give you some myths that we think that we can effectively challenge as a way of building a broader consensus for affirmative action. But then I got a call from Howie, who said he was sweetening the deal and inviting me to actually come and address the conference. And so now I've decided to talk to you about the other project that I'm working on that is perhaps a little more closely related to the subject matter of the conference. And that has to do with violence against women and its effects, particularly with respect to incarceration. So let me tell you a little bit about that project and then show you a couple of the ideas that frame the project and then get to some stories. One of the things that we are interested in at the ACLU Women's Rights Project is figuring out how to best engage the public on questions about women's equality. And our sense is that we really need to articulate better in more persuasive and compelling ways why gender justice is still a compelling issue. My interest as the Racial Justice Fellow is to ensure that as we talk about and articulate gender justice, we do so recognizing the differences among women and making sure that no women are left behind in our attempts to politicize questions of gender. Now, one of the projects that has taken up our attention comes from the anti-violence movement. Many of you are familiar, I believe, with Eve Ensler and the Vagina Monologues. If I am right, I wouldn't be surprised if it hasn't been performed here sometime within the last decade. Those of you who are familiar with Eve Ensler and the Vagina Monologues will know that the Vagina Monologues is performed all over the world in February. It has become now a movement called V-Day, and it's raised more than $24 million to support efforts on behalf of women to fight back against the violence that shapes their lives. Where V-Day is going now is precisely in a direction that should interest all of us who are interested in prisons. One of the compelling critiques of the anti-violence movement over the course of the last 2 decades is its failure to take seriously and with deep concern the relationship that the movement has forged between women and the police, between women and the state, between activists and incarceration. So one of the things that V-Day was hoping to illuminate in response to a lot of this criticism is the relationship between women's vulnerability to violence and their incarceration. So we're working together with V-Day to put on a major event in New York in June, and it's titled Any One of Us. And the idea is that any woman at any point might find herself in a situation in which she's vulnerable to violence, and depending on her context and depending on what's happened to her, may, as a consequence of that vulnerability to violence, end up being incarcerated. Those are the stories that we're hoping to tell in this event. And what we have done is work with incarcerated women in several different prisons, worked with them as they wrote their life stories. Their life stories will be read and performed by actors such as Kerry Washington, such as Rosie O'Donnell, various actors who will bring notoriety and attention to the problem. Well, what I want to share with you in the latter part of my talk is some of these writings, basically to talk about whether popularization through narrative does the work of trying to change the face, the way we think about violence and the way we think about incarceration. Now, I am an academic, so I can't resist the need to establish a theoretical framework for the work. So those activists, bear with me. I'm going to try to make it quick and painless. For those who are familiar with intersectionality, I'm going to try to use that as a way of staging an interaction between 2 different movements. Thus the title of my talk, A Tale of Two Movements. And my objectives are twofold. First, I want to use intersectionality as a way to better understand the interactive effects of racism, of gender, of class, of other markers of subordination as they create risk factors that lead to high rates of women's incarceration. So in one sense, this is an engagement, friendly, critical engagement with the anti-incarceration movement, a challenge to tell a deeper, more nuanced story behind the growing rates of incarceration among women. On a second level, I want to underscore the need to develop more comprehensive efforts to address the multiple consequences of violence. So this is an interaction with the anti-violence movement. It is a call, it is a challenge for those women who are organized around rape and domestic violence to think about the consequences of victimization, not solely in terms of the actual physical assaults, but some of the consequences that some women end up facing as a result of having been vulnerable to these forms of violence. So part of the challenge is to encourage domestic violence and rape activists to think beyond the interventions that they tend to focus on, and to think about incarceration in a slightly different way, not as a solution to victimization, but as as a risk factor for women who are actually victimized by gender violence. So my itinerary will begin with just a way of framing intersectionality, not as a sword, but instead as a bridge. Second, I will conceptualize the intersectional framework, basically just map out the metaphor, because after all, it is really a metaphor. If the metaphor helps us, we should use it. If it doesn't help us, we should amend it or use something different. And finally, telling tales. I want to tell a few tales that I think highlight the intersectional dynamics that lead to higher levels of women's incarceration. As I said, one of the reasons why I want to frame intersectionality as a bridge is partially to push back against some of the ways that intersectionality has been received. I'm always kind of surprised when I read how intersectionality is cited, or when I get emails asking, can intersectionality be used to frame experiences other than African American women? And I find that puzzling, because in a lot of the work that I've written and I've seen other people write, intersectionality has been used to frame a whole range of interactive subordinating processes that affect an entire range of people. So some part of what I want to do is resist the tendency to articulate intersectionality as a narrow identity politic. Sometimes I see it as anti-identity politic. Sometimes I see it as only about race and gender, and sometimes I see it as only about African American women. And I want to suggest that I think all of those are limitations that are not necessary limitations. And I think if we start thinking about theoretical interventions as bridges, as ways of addressing some of the elisions that occur in theory and in political practice, then our tendency to read these as limited might be resisted. So the particular gap that I'm interested in bridging then is the gap between a structural experience and a rhetorical politic. The structural experience that I want to highlight is the way in which women of color and other marginalized people face risk factors that lead them to risk for incarceration as a product of the overlapping dynamics that shape their lives. So there's a structural reality that is just material. It is there. But there is also a political reality that the intersecting features that make some people face higher risk for incarceration isn't always articulated either in the anti-incarceration movement or in the anti-violence movement. So I want to focus both on the factors, but more importantly, the politics. What gets talked about, what gets imagined, what gets envisioned, and what doesn't get talked about, and what doesn't get envisioned. So one might ask, what is it that intersectionality tries to bring into view? What is it that's missing from our understanding? What is it that the standard lens, the standard prism, the standard articulations tend to miss? And a couple years ago when I was first writing about this, there are a couple of examples that I thought were just really quite profound illustrations of what gets missed and the consequences of it when we frame our politics around single issue articulations, or when we think about the subject of the various subordinating policies that we're against only in terms of the most privileged members of that group. Namely, if we think about racism only in terms of men, or if we think of sexism only in terms of women who are white or who are middle class. Here's one example. When I was trying to get some statistics about the rate of domestic violence across different communities, I was aware that in Los Angeles that these statistics were collected by precinct. And because Los Angeles is relatively racially segregated, one could get a rough sense about the prevalence of violence among different racial groups by looking at these statistics. So I knew they existed. What I wasn't anticipating is the resistance to releasing these statistics and the articulation for why they wouldn't be released. So I was told two different things, and they were interesting. From those members on the police commission who were primarily representatives of communities of color and who were deeply concerned about the high risk that communities of color faced with respect to police brutality. Their concern was that if these statistics were released, it would support one of the arguments that was used to support state repression, namely, these are deeply violent communities. Look at what they do to each other. If this is what they do to each other, imagine what police have to confront when they go there. So their concern was we have to keep a lid on this information because it will disrupt the political articulation that we have here, which is there is no justifiable reason for the police to treat us in the way that they do. A parallel argument was made by various anti-domestic violence activists. Their argument was, look, we have been struggling with the police department for over 20 years to force them to recognize that domestic violence is not just a problem of poor women, not just a problem of colored women, it is a problem of middle-class women, West Side women, and white women. If we release these statistics, it's going to support the stereotype that justifies the police taking a laissez-faire attitude towards domestic violence. So we have to fight against this attempt to racialize the image of the domestic violence victim because the movement depends on our ability to show that all women are equally vulnerable to domestic violence. Now, what I want to focus on is what this rhetorical politic elides, what gets marginalized in the process. What got marginalized was the experience of women of color. What got marginalized is the complex relationship that women have with respect to the state on one hand and with respect to men in their communities on the other. What got marginalized is the actual picture, the occurrence, the ability to bring up and make visible the fact that domestic violence occurs, the fact that women are in a complex situation, and the fact that we have not yet developed a rhetorical politics to articulate it. So as a consequence, an entire set of experiences were never articulated, and the challenge that those experiences mean and make to the traditional way we think about anti-state violence on one hand and anti-patriarchal violence on the other hand is never talked about. So I would suggest that this is a problem fairly familiar to a lot of us of the traditional ways in which we talk about identity politics. In the most traditional way, when we organize as groups, we organize as women and we call ourselves feminists and we fight against gender subordination. When we are anti-racist, we organize as people of color and our supporters, and we fight against something called racism. We fight against we fight against classism, we fight against politics that subordinate people on the basis of class, and a whole range of other movements in which we imagine ourselves to be fighting for a group that's marked in a particular way. What's potentially problematic about this understanding is that we take these as mutually exclusive communities. Our politics are articulated as mutually exclusive articulations. And most problematically, the leadership of these movements tend to reflect those who either are not themselves burdened by a range of other subordinating factors, or if they are, do not articulate them in their politics. So as a consequence, we have a narrow range in which we imagine the issue that we're struggling against to manifest itself. So in most traditional forms of, say, race politics, race is imagined as a conflict often a conflict between men, or a conflict between communities, or more broadly or progressively, a conflict between the state and communities. But if you scratch the surface, go a little bit deeper, eventually the male identification of that community comes to fore. Similarly, we tend to think about gender as conflicts between men and women. You scratch the surface a little bit, and it's conflicts between dominant men and women. It's conflicts between white men and women. We don't immediately think, when we think about gender conflict, women of color don't really come to mind. Now, just in case we wonder whether this is still the way in which these things are imagined, I mean, after all, people have been talking about this for 20 years. I was interested to just ask people what they thought of when they saw these various pictures, right? So the first picture, some of you may recognize it. This is the picture that was taken immediately after the March on Washington. This is power and resistance negotiating. This is the president and the leaders of the civil rights movement. These are the leaders of the civil rights movement. This pretty much tells you most of what you need to know about how the civil rights movement was initially imagined or articulated. Who's doing the negotiation for what? What are the issues? How are they framed? Where are women in this? Now, unless you think that was a long time ago, and actually it was, this other picture is a little more recent. This is from the reproductive choice movement that was less than 5 years ago. This is the imagination, this is the representation of the leadership of the movement, but it also more or less represents what we think is most germane about the movement. These are the people that are at the center, these are the ones that articulate what we think the issues are and who we think the issues should address. So at the end of the day, although race is experienced across gender, across class, across sexual orientation differently, the quintessential representations of those differences tend not to be represented in our rhetorical politics or in the way these issues are represented. And the same can be said of gender. So what intersectional politics attempts to stage is an interactive articulation. What it attempts to recognize is that we all are intersectional, that we all experience a range of dynamics, both that subordinate us and sometimes that provide us privileges and escapes from what might otherwise be the consequences of racism in our lives, or of sexism, or of homophobia. So part of the challenge is figuring out, how do we create a politic that addresses race, but doesn't do so in an exclusive way, the way race is experienced by one gender, or the way sexism is experienced by one race? So intersectionality is asking those questions, and it's forcing us to deal with the structural overlap and with the rhetorical politics. So, some part of intersectionality is meant to address invisibility. And so you might ask me here, well, who's invisible? Well, let's take what tends to be the primary subject around which intersectionality is articulated. And in this talk, I am talking largely about marginalized women, women of color, incarcerated women. In what way, might you ask, are these women's stories made invisible? After all, when in the anti-incarceration movement we talk about large numbers of people of color being incarcerated, we don't just say men, we say people. We point out that women are the fastest growing group, so aren't we talking about all people? And as far as women are concerned, particularly in the domestic violence movement, there are always pictures of women of color as being the target of anti-violence organizing. When we think even globally about women, we always imagine different kinds of women being represented. So what possibly do you mean when you say that traditional rhetorical politics render women of color invisible? Well, let me try to mark out a couple of ways that this invisibility, I would say, takes place, and then let's test it out on some of these stories. Let's see if the stories that I tell you sound really, really familiar, or do they sound surprising to us. One way that women of color in between these two movements end up being rendered invisible is what I call over-inclusion. So over-inclusion, I mean to suggest that, yes, their presence in the overall group for which a particular risk factor is being politicized is happening. So yes, we understand that women of color are also facing high rates of incarceration. But the particular risk factors that render them amenable to incarceration aren't often included in the agendas that get set. So yes, they're part of the great group of people who are vulnerable, but no, we don't really talk a whole lot about what is different about their vulnerability, how it is that their particular place, their structural location makes them vulnerable to violence. And some of it is a product of what we foreground in how we talk about the issue. So when we talk about the state and when we talk about incarceration, we tend to talk about incarceration primarily as a function of race, of class, and of state power, right? The way the state is using incarceration as a technology of oppression. Right? Those are the primary ideas that I would suggest that we move around when we talk about these issues. What we don't talk about is how private relations are also driving incarceration of women. What we don't talk about is the gender-specific experiences that women have. We talk about the gender-specific experiences of men. That's caught up in race. But where women live is usually in the private arena. Where their issues are usually manifest is in private relations. They sometimes are called cultural, right? It's sometimes called the social realm. But it is the realm in which women experience a range of vulnerabilities that then places them in the position for the state to incarcerate them. So I call it over-inclusion because they're in there, but the particular things that make them most vulnerable often aren't discussed at all. They sometimes run against the overall theory that grounds the movement. Now, under-inclusion is another way that women are made invisible. So within the anti-violence movement, when we think about how domestic violence and rape functions in the political imagination of those who are organizing against it, it's seen primarily as a function of gender in the private arena. And the problem is it remains private. So the objective is to try to bring it into the public. The objective is to try to make the state accountable. The objective is to try to make this a matter of police intervention, right? So the issue there is the problem that it's marginalized as private, and it's marginalized as private because it's gendered. That's where women exist historically. So that's what the struggle is, bringing this thing that's gendered as private into the public. Well, what happens with respect to women of color? What happens with respect to communities that are already targeted as objects of state oppression? This attempt to bring private violence into the public arena becomes all the more complicated, right? It becomes complicated first in terms of the kinds of strategies that are called for. For example, one of the biggest debates among the domestic violence community is the notion of mandatory arrest. If the problem in domestic violence is people aren't being arrested, then what we need to do is make sure that every time the police go to a home call, somebody is getting arrested. Right? As it turns out, women of color are as likely to be arrested under mandatory arrest statutes as men of color. As it turns out, this didn't end up being an effective intervention for a lot of women of color. Right? More problematically, the consequences of domestic violence when they move into incarceration are not included in the women's agenda. right? So if you were to, say, surf to the website of one of the major women's groups, I'm just speculating, and you saw a list of, say, the top 5 issues that they're concerned about, I would be willing to bet that incarceration is not going to appear there, right? Now, why is that? Because the risk factors for incarceration are thoroughly gendered, right? The way that women come into the crosshairs of the state has everything to do with who they are relative to men in their lives and what roles they play, right? So gender shapes their vulnerability. There's no substantive reason why the gendered consequences of violence and the gendered factors that lead to incarceration are not part of the women's movement. There's no substantive reason. There's an identity reason. Most of the women who are incarcerated are poor women and they're women of color. They're not seen as part of the primary constituency of the women's movement. So I call this under-inclusion. The issue is there. It's calling out for inclusion, but it's not. Why is it not? It's largely because of who they are. It's largely because of the image of what they represent, that they're not part of that movement. Now, let me throw a couple other ideas at you, and then I want to say something about this metaphor and give you some stories before we run out of time together. Another way in which under-inclusion happens, I have a little story about this. I call it misappropriation. So the stories are in there. The identity of the subjects of the oppression are included, but not because you want to pay attention to them and figure out how to address their need, but because you want to really reinforce the fact that the main subject of discrimination is really having a hard time of it. Let me give you an example. It'll make it a little clearer. I used to TA for a particular judge who's well known as a civil rights advocate extraordinaire, and he used to teach a course on slavery. And in this course on slavery, he would talk a lot about the horrors of the plantation community. And in his story about the horrors, there was always a moment where he would talk about the sexual abuse of African American women. And he would lead into and exit the story by saying, can you imagine what it must have been like to have to sit aside and watch your mother, your sister, your daughter, your aunt, your grandmother being abused by the plantation owner? Can you imagine what that would have been like? And it always occurred to me that that was an odd way of trying to talk about the horror of sexual abuse. Surely it must have been very difficult to have to watch that happen. But surely it couldn't have been worse than having it happen to you. And yet this is the way in which the story circulated. I call it a misappropriation. It's there, it's articulated, but after articulating it, we go back to focusing on what it meant for the man to have to watch it rather than what it meant for the woman to have to experience it. That I would say is an invisibility move. It's rendering that particular subordination invisible. And the last one, literally I call the invisible hand. And in this one, what I'm trying to get at is the way that the intersectional nature of the subordination is rendered invisible. We see one piece of it, but we don't see the whole piece. I'll give you an example of this from the World Conference on Racism, where a lot of us spent some time in 2001. We were mobilizing with other marginalized people all over the world, and one group that we spent a fair amount of time lobbying with was the Dalits, otherwise known as the Untouchables in India. And one of the common stories that we heard a lot was to tell a story about Dalit violence, what would happen. And so a typical story was that Dalit women, when they went to the public wells to collect water for their family, if they accidentally touched the spigot or accidentally touched some higher class women, would be subject to punitive violence, some of it deadly violence. And so this often sort of represented what anti-Dalit violence looked like. And it is. There's no question about it. It's also intersectional, right? Because it's only the women who had the privately distributed responsibility to actually have to negotiate public space in order to get the necessities for their family to live on a day-to-day basis. So there's a gendered structure that was in place that put the women in the position to be subject to the anti-caste violence. So it was intersectional. There was something that happened first that then allowed the anti-Dalit violence to hit her. Now, those of you who are globalists would say, well, there's even another layer. Why is it that certain communities have to go to wells every day to get water? Why don't they have running water? So the bigger backdrop is the underdevelopment that is a quintessential part of globalization, right? So certain communities are put in the position of having to decide who it is who has to negotiate the public space, that therefore places them in a vulnerable position to experience violence, right? So why do we care about getting it right? If we don't get it right, if we don't articulate the structural predeterminates of the violence, then how are our interventions going to be successful, right? How are we going to ensure that all the people that we're hoping to incorporate into our remedy are actually included if we don't have every dimension of which they're vulnerable included in our articulation of the problem? So let me tell you the quick metaphor and then give you some examples. So as I said, it's just a metaphor. There's not, some kind of, I don't know, I'm not making a claim for anything more than what it is, a way of thinking, a heuristic device for mapping certain relationships. So I think of intersectionality basically in terms first of axes of power or subordination. Right? So if we think about racism as flowing along a thoroughfare that, say, moves in a southerly direction, and let's say we think about patriarchy, sexism, as moving in an east to west direction, and we think about heterosexism and homophobia crisscrossing, class crisscrossing. If we think about each of these axes as deeply grounded structures of subordination, we have the tendency to think that they've always been there, but it's a little bit like the Grand Canyon, right? For millions of years of the same kind of energy, the same kind of dynamic flowing through, it creates deep structural grooves that then become the thoroughfares for more contemporary forms of this dynamic to flow through. So the roads or the axes are what we traditionally think of as the structure of race or the structure of gender. And the traffic along the intersection is the contemporary issues, the contemporary power, the contemporary decisions, the contemporary effects that flow through there. So that's the background structure. And the intersectional moment is where subordination intersects each other and collides with those who happen to be located in its wake, right? So some of us, many of us, are always in intersectional locations to receive this traffic that runs over and through because of where we happen to be located. It's not inherent into who we are. It's where we happen to be located by these deep structures. Okay. So I offer this as perhaps a way of thinking a little bit more critically about women's vulnerability to incarceration. After all, most of the women that are incarcerated face a range of intersecting, subordinating dynamics, patriarchy. Obviously, violence is a product of male power over women. We can call it sexism, we can call it patriarchy, we can call it misogyny. There's a power relationship between men and women that plays out on women's bodies and often puts them in a situation where they are more vulnerable. Class. Not all women who are subject to violence necessarily face the same risk of incarceration. It depends on what options you have once you find yourself victimized by gender violence. Some women have options. It's not saying that they are not affected, but the collateral consequences are going to be different. And race plays a role depending on whether you think domestic violence, for example, is a collateral consequence of racism. I don't necessarily know if I buy that, but some people believe that's the case. But how and where you are when you experience your violence, whether or not you are then made more vulnerable to other kinds of dynamics that are occurring. For example, the war on drugs. For example, the crack cocaine distinctions. All of these are vulnerabilities, they're risk factors that make your experience of violence more likely to have you wind up in prison. So, what do we know about these women? We know that they're the fastest growing segment. We know that there are 8 times as many in 1980 now as there were in 1980 in real numbers. That translates into 182,000 or so women, and that was in 2001. When you expand that to look at all forms of criminal supervision, more than 1 million women are under supervision. California, not too surprisingly, has the largest population after, not too surprisingly, Texas. In terms of the increase of African American women incarceration outpaces other women by almost 2 to 1. And in terms of the causes, clearly the drug-related offenses is the most salient factor leading to the increase of incarceration of women. Now, all incarceration for other crimes were up 129%, but for drug-related offenses, it's 888%. In fact, the percentage of women incarcerated for drug-related offenses is higher than the percentage of men incarcerated for drug-related offenses. And these are basically those facts. Now, who are they? In California, 54% of the women in the prison population are convicted of drug crimes. In New York, it's 91% of the women of color there are convicted of drug crimes. And they're disproportionately mothers. 65% of women in state prison have a minor child, and only 1 in 4 of these mothers say that their child is living with the other parent. So there's a huge problem created in terms of primary caretaking for children of mothers in prison. Now, as I tell you these stories, as I tell you these facts, I know your eyes probably glaze over, because if we don't have facts in context, what can we do with them? They're just stories. They don't wrap themselves around any particular image. We can't quite put it all together to come up with a narrative. So I want to give you a few narratives in the time I have left. Maybe I'll just give you 2. I want to first tell you a story about Yvonne. Now, what do I want you to do with these stories? As you listen to them, I want you to identify what factors you think are creating her vulnerability to incarceration. I want you to identify where is the race in this? Where is the class in this? Where is the gender in this? How does it play a role in leading to incarceration? And have I thought about this before? Do I imagine this as part of the story about domestic violence, or do I imagine it as part of the story of incarceration? And I want to pause a moment to welcome my mother, Marion Crenshaw. And my colleague, Devin Carbato from UCLA. So, Yvonne worked as a barber in an upscale unisex salon in Harlem. Although the salon attracted an upscale clientele, she was barely able to earn enough with tips to support her family of 2 children and her extended family of her mother, grandmother, and brother. She was the only one in the home to be regularly employed. Now, although she faced financial challenges, she really liked her job. She was interested in all the different kind of people that she met. She was particularly interested in a person who came in a lot. His name was John. He was one of the only white guys who hung out in Harlem, and he always seemed to be sympathetic and listened to her stories of how difficult it was to make ends meet. And frequently he'd offer her a little help if she would help him out. She tended to resist this idea because she had a suspicion that he was involved in drugs and just really didn't want to have a part of it. She also didn't want to have any part of her boss's designs. Now, he routinely made demands on her to date him, to give him sexual favors. He's the owner of the salon. He fancied himself somewhat of a ladies' man. He could pretty much date anyone he wanted to, but Yvonne really posed a challenge, and eventually the challenge kind of made him angry. One day while she was stacking supplies in the ready room, he came behind her and pinned her against the wall, groped under her skirt, tried to pull off her underwear. She broke free, attempted to knee him in the groin. She reached for the door. He got there before she did, blocked her at exit. He told her that the games were over. Either she would do what he wanted or she would be fired. Now, he was convinced that she needed the job way too much to walk away. So you can imagine how stunned he was when she quit. He said she'd be back and was left stunned as she slammed the door behind her. Now, her decision was pretty costly for her family. Her salary was meager, but the salary did provide low-cost health care that she desperately needed for her asthmatic son. Because she quit her job, she was ineligible for unemployment, and it would take months before her son would be covered under the state health plan. So within weeks of quitting her job, she had to choose between buying medicine for her son or food for her family. As a last-ditch effort, she decided that she would try to go freelance, and so she created some flyers and distributed it around the neighborhood. And not too surprisingly, the first call she got was from John. Now, John was not interested in her cutting his hair, but he did say that he would provide her $3,000 if he did one little favor, and that is to take a small package on the train to Albany to drop it off to a friend. Now, she had an idea about what might be in the package, but she didn't ask. She'd been around drugs all her life, hadn't used them, hadn't sold them, but she didn't think she would get into a lot of trouble for just taking this small package upstate. Now, on a cold Thursday morning, she shoved this brown paper package into the front of her jeans and walked out of the apartment, caught a train to Albany where John met her. He met her at the station, took her to a small room in a local motel. 2 more men were waiting. She dropped the bag in John's hands. To her surprise, the package contained not 5 ounces of cocaine, but 5 ounces of crack. Someone placed the bag on the scale. The 3 men agreed to the price. The buyer left the room and came back with a lot of cash. Seconds later, a group of armed police officers stormed the room. Yvonne was arrested. At her arraignment, her first thought when she was taken into the courtroom was that she was the only black person there. Her lawyer, her prosecutor, the judge, they were all white. Now, the defense attorney encouraged that she plead guilty and work as an informant, and she would only get 5 years to life. He warned her of the long sentence she would face if she lost at trial, but she just couldn't imagine working for the police and really didn't believe that she could get a long sentence for her minor role. At her trial, she learned that John was an informant, helping the cops arrest new people and testifying in court, and earning money and avoiding prison in exchange. She learned that the buyer was a state police officer. What she couldn't have imagined is that the state's war on drugs involved the cops and the prosecutors commonly luring people from New York City to Albany because of its tough on drugs judges and juries. And although she never heard of the state's Rockefeller drug laws, they do mandate long, harsh, mandatory minimums for drug crimes. After a 2-day trial, the jury found her guilty of first-degree sale, a felony, and she was sentenced to the maximum 20 years in prison in New York's largest women's prison, hundreds of miles from New York City, and her 2 children. Most of the women that she met there, 91% of the black women she met there, were there because of drug crimes. Let me tell you Rosa's story. Rosa immigrated to Rochester from Guatemala to marry Rafael, a family acquaintance who had moved to the U.S. as a teenager. She'd become acquainted with Rafael when he returned home to a small town in a homecoming. They found quiet moments at his party to talk about his life in the United States. He told her that he worked hard in the U.S., had become a successful restaurant owner and a U.S. citizen. An earlier marriage to another woman failed, but left him with a son. He told Rosa that he was looking for a good woman from his home country to be the kind of wife who he could share his values and success with. She was impressed with his hard work, his sincerity, and his traditional values. They each promised to continue their relationship through phone calls and letters, and eventually Rosa was persuaded to move to Rochester to marry Rafael. Now, when she moved to New York, she began to help him in the restaurant by greeting customers and occasionally working her special magic in the kitchen. She was popular among the Guatemalan customers who were eager to hear about life back home and to enjoy her authentic home cooking. She was delighted to fit in so effortlessly. Yet, Rafael became jealous and resentful of the attention she was getting. Rafael watched her constantly and often accused her of flirting with customers and giving extra attention to the younger men. Her movements were increasingly monitored. Shopping for supplies became an ordeal if she was late. Any delay would prompt an argument that sometimes ended in a threat or a slap or even a black eye. Rafael's 12-year-old son, Roberto, sometimes attempted to protect Rosa, but he too received his father's wrath. Violence for Roberto was not new. Unfortunately, he had become the target of his father's rage when his own mother was no longer in the picture. Rosa became even more frightened when she learned that Rafael's first wife had been hospitalized for many months after an accident in the kitchen that left her with 3rd and 4th degree burns. Also an immigrant, she too had faced years of abuse, but was reluctant to call the authorities for fear of deportation. Now incapacitated, she was unable to care for Roberto. Lacking medical care, she lived homeless in destitution. Rosa worried that Rafael might one day kill both his son and her, but she couldn't see a way out. A turning point came during the time the restaurant was preparing a special holiday celebration. She prepared a special meal for the day and dressed nicely to greet the customers. Convinced, though, that she was attempting to garner the attention of the younger men, he began to berate Rosa, accusing her of selling herself to the highest bidder. Rosa argued back, pointing out that she was pulling her own weight and didn't need to sell her body to anyone. Enraged, he wrestled Rosa to the ground, choking her and punching her in the face. Only the sound of arriving customers stopped Rafael's beating. He locked her in the refrigerator to cool down. Although she feared deportation, because she had not stayed properly married for 2 years, she decided that she had had enough. When Rafael released her from the refrigeration room, she apologized and encouraged him to take a nap. As he retired to the back room, she took the checkbook, a few bills out of the cash register, snuck upstairs to gather Roberto, and disappeared. Desperate with no place to go, she called a Spanish-speaking hotline to seek shelter. The crisis counselor at the other end was very understanding, but was unable to find shelter that offered Spanish-speaking services and that would accommodate Rafael as well. She told Rosa to call back shortly, but when she did, she was told that they would not be able to admit anyone who could not benefit from their empowerment training because they didn't speak English. Rosa indicated that Roberto could translate for her, but the shelter refused this resolution because, in their view, her dependency on him would further victimize the victim. Rosa gave up on the shelter and wandered the streets with Roberto looking for an inexpensive hotel room. She had enough money for a few nights, but wound up being evicted when she couldn't pay the bill after the third night. So she kept having flashbacks of Raphael's beating and the sexual harassment that she experienced. And worse still, she overheard someone telling somebody else that there was a restaurateur who was looking for his wife and was definitely going to kill her. She was paralyzed with fear. She used their last money to take a train to New York. As her health deteriorated and her mental focus was lost, she found it harder and harder to take the steps she needed. The homeless shelter provided no services for either her or her stepson. She worried that he was missing school, so she was desperate to find a way out. She started passing bad checks, buying merchandise in the stores that she resold on the street for cash so she could afford her own place. One day, the police picked her up for selling items on the street without a peddler's license, and it turned out she had outstanding warrants and a kidnapping charge. Those charges were dropped in a plea bargain. She did plead guilty to grand larceny and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Roberto was returned to Raphael, but within months he was on the street again too. In prison, most of the women that she met were also victims of domestic violence, even as children and some as adults. Some suffered depression, other kind of mental illnesses. There was very little counseling and no treatment. When she was finally released from prison as part of her effort to regain her life again, she sought public housing. However, Public Housing Authority told her that she was ineligible for housing assistance due to her prior conviction. Because of her conviction, she couldn't find an employer who would hire her, and as a result, she couldn't even afford housing on the private market. So once again, she found herself on the street out of desperation and without a legal source of income. She supported herself occasionally through prostitution. With no place to live, she was physically and sexually assaulted on multiple occasions. She never reported these crimes to law enforcement because she believed she would be arrested. Eventually, she was rounded up in a police crackdown initiated by the mayor to make the streets safe. Because she was deemed a repeat offender and she had not received permanent resident status before she left Raphael, she was held for nearly 18 months and was eventually deported back to Guatemala. And finally, let me tell you a little something about Angela. Now, to hear her mother tell it, she was a go-getter from the start. Her take-charge style really paid off well. She was the first to go to college. She went to business school. Within years, she had purchased a car dealership and was a successful distributor of luxury cars and trucks. Her luck with men wasn't that good, though. A short relationship before college produced her son, Kevin. She worried about raising him without a father figure, though, but she was really careful about the men that she brought into her life. Her son, though, took to a particular mentor in an after-school program, and after Angela met him, she understood why. Andre was a good, supportive, and loving figure in Kevin's life, and eventually found a place in Angela's heart as well. He was also good for Angela's business. He brought in a private investor, a gregarious man named Peter, who agreed to become a silent partner in the development of many more of their distributorships. An accountant by trade, Angela turned all the bookkeeping over to Andre. Life couldn't be better when she found out that they would be expecting. With no reason to wait, the two got married and formed a perfect family. Her life took a dramatic turn for the worse when police arrived at the dealership and arrested Andre. When she was finally able to see him in lockup, he told her that the arrest was a big mistake, that he would be out once he was released. Angela was stunned to find that he was being held on a $250,000 bond. Their cash flow was tight, and she couldn't come up with the necessary resources, so Andre gave Angela the name and the number of a client who owed him money. She should call to demand the money right away, and Angela could bail him out. She made the call, and slightly after the contact wired $100,000 into her account, she was arrested by federal officers who had received a warrant to tap the phone. She was shocked to find out that she was charged with money laundering, constructive possession, and conspiracy to distribute drugs. Thinking it was all an enormous mistake, she kept her cool and told prosecutors all she knew. When she finally did get a lawyer, she was shocked to find out that she was facing 24 years, a mandatory minimum for conspiracy to distribute 500 grams of crack. Angela never sold drugs, never handled drug money, and was unaware that her business was being used to launder drug money. Prosecutors provided Angela with one ray of hope. If she would name her co-conspirators, she might be eligible for a downward departure in her sentence. The only person Angela knew, though, was Andre, and she couldn't believe that he was knowingly part of this disaster. She couldn't provide any information and was eventually convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. She was stunned when she heard that Andre, who did have some information to share about the new investor, received a less stringent sentence. Worse was still to come. Angela's mother had agreed to move into her home to care for her young son, but a few months after her incarceration, her home, her cars, and businesses were all seized by the federal government under forfeiture laws. With no place to stay and no assets, Angela's mother struggled to take care of Kevin. Angela worried about what would happen to her unborn child as well. Her mother was pushed to the edge and could barely survive. In the months that followed, her worst fears came true. She became increasingly worried about her baby's health as her due date neared. There was no gynecological or prenatal care in the prison at all. When she began to go into labor, she notified the prison guards, and they insisted that she be shackled to the bed by using leg irons to prevent her from escaping during her labor. Of course, that was the last thing that was on Angie's mind. Also, she began to hemorrhage, and the fetal heart rate decreased. A cesarean was needed, a delay that caused 5 minutes and could have resulted in permanent brain damage to the baby. Fortunately, the girl was healthy. However, she was only able to stay with Angie a few hours. She was told that the baby would be given to her mother, but soon her mother fell ill, and state custody took charge. Now, in the absence of a mother who was able to take care of the baby, eventually the state filed a petition to take both of the children out of Angie's custody. Angie's harsh sentence destroyed her children's life. For Kevin especially, it robbed him of both his mother and of his childhood. He would hardly get to know his little sister Angela as well. Kevin is also caught up in the same problems that his mother faced. He's now 25 and also in the criminal justice system. Neither he nor his sister have any relationship with his mother. Angela had hopes that she might be pardoned by the president after a few high-profile cases, but he only pardoned a few, left office, and Angela remains in Danbury Prison in Connecticut. So I tell you these stories hopefully as a way to see the intersection of gender violence and the threat of the racialized war on drugs, how it targets certain communities, and of what I generally call structural adjustment. There's no money for treatment, no money for domestic violence shelters, no money for housing. All of these come together to create the vulnerabilities. How do we build a better movement? We flip the script. We make sure that our politics are anti-patriarchal, are anti-state violence, are anti-racism at the same time. None of these women should have to beg to be centered in anti-gender violence movements and in anti-incarceration movements. We should be able to tell these stories at the tip of our tongues in the same way we can tell the story about crack cocaine, in the same way we can tell the story about racial profiling, in the same way we can tell the story about rape. We should be able to tell the story about about all of these women. If we can reimagine the victims, if we can reimagine their vulnerabilities, we can better tell the story that illuminates the intersecting patterns of power that delimit their lives, and we can better create a politics that ensures all victims of all forms of violence have our attention. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say to the conservatives who simplify everything and say things like, well, if you don't do drugs, if you don't get married before you're 20 and don't have kids before you're 25, you're going to be okay. What do you say to those people?
I say Bush's daughter. I mean, you know, quite simply. I mean, I have to say that as a person that opposes incarceration for drug dependency and opposes even the role of the government in trying to prosecute Rush Limbaugh for his private addiction, I don't oppose using these stories as illustrative of the deep contradiction. It's similar to what I was talking about earlier about under-inclusion. The point of the war on drugs is to declare war on certain peoples, not to declare war on the actual use and not to create these penalties across the board. So the very fact that, I mean, I'm a great believer in using contradiction to political ends. I will use these stories to point out that the consequences of drug dependency are different depending on who you are. So this don't do it, oh, so you're saying don't do as I do, but do as I say do, which is the reality. That's the moment of power in which certain prescriptions are placed on communities that are subordinate, that are not being placed on their own. So, you know, I think whenever those stories are articulated, there are always the moments where you can point out the tension and the contradiction and the fact that people are not even remotely consistent with what they consider to be their own draconian drug policies. Yes?
Just last month, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission issued a memorandum where they have now have instructions and guidelines that mention intersectional discrimination for the very first time, and they give specific example of black women as a contemporary form of intersectional discrimination, which I find is rather interesting, and to your efforts. With regards to the context of the legal, well, that's probably the one area where this might actually be able to be promoted in some kind of interesting way. How do you see that playing out within regards to the intersectional argument, and also within regards to the context of black males, the intersectionality of gender and race for black men and the plight that poor black men face in the society?
Okay, thanks for the question. It's been actually a while since courts have acknowledged the possibility of making an intersectional claim. The challenge is to develop the rules that show what difference an intersectional claim would actually make. So I'll give you an example, say out of sexual harassment. One of the challenges of bringing any sexual harassment claim, particularly one that looks at hostile environment, is a question of quantification. How much hostility does there have to be in order to substantiate the claim that the work environment is so hostile that it constitutes discrimination? Now, the problem with the intersectional claim is that women of color are often trying to say that, well, if you look at the evidence in a disaggregated way. First, you just look at the racial evidence. Well, you know, basically what the harasser did was put black in front of everything, every sexist thing he said to you. And what he said was, you know, he called you a mule, or he called you a buffalo butt, or something like that. That these two things, you know, looked at in a disaggregated way, you know, neither of those seem to be enough to constitute a hostile work environment. But as we know, those aren't experienced as, you know, sort of disaggregated things. So the question is whether courts are going to use intersectionality to say that when these two things are thought about and articulated together, they do constitute enough of a hostile work environment, so that even if you were to disaggregate them, you might not find them separately, but looking at them together and looking at the particular way that women are marginalized from other women and from other people of color would be enough to constitute discrimination. So the challenge in all of these is for them to actually develop the actual rules of proof. We know conceptually that it's possible, but what are plaintiffs going to have to be able to show in order to actualize this possibility? The same basically is true with respect to African American men in a workforce. The issue in all of these cases is whether it's enough to say that, well, we hire black women, so you can't claim race discrimination, and we hire white men, so you can't claim gender discrimination. In all of these instances, the point is to try to be able to tell a story that courts will hear that is specific to that group of people and doesn't try to marginalize or erase the discrimination because other members of the group are well treated. So it's basically the same issue, and it's always going to be fact dependent as to whether the court takes seriously the idea that you can have a discriminator that treats one group of people in a race well and others not in a race. Just as an aside, another area that is somewhat parallel to this is intra-racial discrimination, discrimination that people of the same race enact against each other. The most common version of it is color-based, but there are other ways that people of color discriminate against themselves. The traditional idea would be, well, no, discrimination is, you know, one race discriminating against the other, but the whole point of this is to understand that there are a lot of other factors that shape people's vulnerability or disempowerment relative to each other, and it's not always categorized as interracial. Often it's intraracial as well. Okay, sure.
One more question. Hold on to you're gonna get mine.
Okay, since I'm breaking out in a rash about this, I'm a little upset, so I'll try to be clear. Does it seem like the best thing to do, rather than try to change the structure, which doesn't help women, is to build new institutions? For example, the people in Chicago that are privately funded anti-violent shelters, where they have Rosie Greer type guys that they hire to keep the violent men away from them, or drug rehab places where some community conflict resolution, not a court, such as they have in Connecticut that Hani Knopp had to do with, that they give the drug users a choice between either going to a jail or going to a rehab, so that they're not fighting with their ego against getting help for themselves, or that since 75% of the alcoholics are also low blood sugar problems, hypoglycemics, that whatever body would look at these alcoholic, crime-committing people, drug-using people, that they be tested for that and that they be given the appropriate diet. It seems like it's such an overhaul that needs to happen. Could your support be aligned with new institutions and some of those organizations as well that you belong to?
Sure. Well, obviously, strategy is context dependent. But I'll say as a general matter, the anti-violence movement and the anti-incarceration movement has to look for alternatives, has to figure out how to articulate realistic interventions that promise to work in the here and now. Particularly with respect to the anti-violence movement, there's often a wish for some way to handle violence that doesn't involve, frankly, getting in the bed with the criminal justice system. There's a recognition that that does not work equally across race and class, and it may actually render women more vulnerable to ever-escalating forms of violence. But at the same time, the idea of community control, community processing hasn't really panned out in a lot of places. So there is a dire need to come up with alternatives that both can bring to bear some kind of enforceable intervention, but that does not necessarily engage the state with its agendas that are not necessarily the agendas of women. The same with respect to drug treatment. And the problem with just simply saying we should move for treatment as opposed to incarceration is that treatment is not necessarily the other side of incarceration. Often it depends on what kind of treatment it is. And then when we talk about women in particular, one of the biggest problems that women who are convicted of drug crimes face in treatment is that the model for a lot of the treatment is an aggressive, get in your face, talk about your own responsibilities, that for women who are experiencing trauma or have experienced sexual abuse is the last thing that you want to do to get them to be able to confront and deal in a holistic and healthy way with what's happened to them. So you can't simply say this as opposed to that. Part of what I try to argue when I talk about let's understand all the factors that lead to the vulnerability is that if you understand that a lot of women who are drug addicted are also victims of incest, rape, and domestic violence, it's obvious that when you say drug treatment, there's a certain kind of treatment that we're looking for and a certain kind of treatment that would not be sufficient. And if we don't articulate that in specificity, then the problem is that women are going to be, re-victimized by the so-called treatment option, which is supposed to be the thing that is reformative. You're welcome. Thank you.